Hello, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about why don't I see veneration in the Bible? This is the next part in my video series on veneration versus worship from the Bible alone. So in the previous video, I talked about the biblical basis for veneration from the Bible. Um, this time we're going to be focusing more on translating that into English and why we don't see more veneration in English in the Bible. And when I started this, I thought it was going to be relatively simple, but it ended up being very in-depth. So I'm very excited to share this information with you because I learned a lot. So stick with me through this. I think you're going to enjoy it. So the distinction between veneration and worship is biblical, but it might not be obvious at first glance, especially if you're reading in English. The Bible provides many examples of proskuenesis, that's bowing or prostrating in Greek, which align with the Christian practice of venerating saints. So the proskuenesis in the Bible has the intention of greeting, honoring, invoking help. These are all meanings that Christians share when they give proskuenesis to saints. It's not necessarily worship. But if veneration is so biblically based, then why don't I see veneration in the Bible? So to answer this question, let's start by setting the goalposts linguistically. Like, what is the definition of venerating the saints? What is the original language? Was the original formula for that? Well, we have that original formula from St. John of Damascus and the Seventh Ecumenical Council in Greek. And Greek happens to be the same language as the Septuagint and the New Testament. So there's this network of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the New Testament, the early church fathers, the Greek fathers, the Seventh Ecumenical Council are all using the same Greek language. So there's no translation issues between these texts, which gives a really nice foundation for defining terms relying on other sources. So in the Bible, the Greek fathers and the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the word for worship and veneration both is the same word, proskuenesis. So instead of using two different words to distinguish between worship to God and honor to saints, they identified two different kinds of proskuenesis. Latrias proskuenesis and timitiki proskuenesis. That is the veneration of divine service or veneration of worship versus the veneration of honor. So this is really, really interesting because it's different than what you will hear in English. You're usually told that the distinction is between adoration and veneration or worship and veneration, but those are two different words. And the original formula provided by the Seventh Ecumenical Council is not two different words, but it's two different kinds of the same word, proskuenesis. And I want to start here by really making this point clear because this is going to cause lots of problems in Latin and English, which are trying to replicate this meaning in their own words and are both going to fail to some extent, and it's going to cause issues. But I really want to drive this idea home that proskuenesis is one word with multiple possible meanings, and the fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council are describing two different kinds of that same word. Latrias proskuenesis and timitiki proskuenesis. Timitiki meaning honor, and latrias meaning divine service. Okay, literally divine service, but can also mean worship in a certain context. So, about the teaching of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, Dr. Richard Price, who translated the minutes of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, he writes, "It is essential to note that the distinction in the Greek is not between proskuenesis, that's veneration, addressed to images and the like, versus latria, worship, expressed to God alone, but rather it's between two kinds of proskuenesis, the veneration of honor, addressed to images, and the veneration of worship offered to God alone." So again, he's making this observation after reading through the entire Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So the Bible provides the basis for this distinction by showing many examples of proskuenesis in both an honorific sense and a worshipful sense. So you're going to see sometimes there are stories in the Bible and somebody will do a latrias proskuenesis or a latrias kind of proskuenesis. Sometimes they're doing a timitiki kind of proskuenesis, and the context will determine which kind that it is. So this is St. John of Damascus. He says the veneration of worship, in the literal words he uses, Latrias Proskuenesis, is one thing. Veneration offered in honor to those who excel on account of something worthy is another. So he's writing this originally in Greek, the exact same language as the fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and he's making a distinction between two different types of proskuenesis, the worshipful kind and then the honorific kind. Seventh Ecumenical Council, this is from its definition. Holy images are to be accorded greeting and the veneration of honor. They use timitiki proskuenesis is the wording they use. Not indeed the true worship, latrian, corresponding to our faith, which pertains to the divine nature alone. So again, latrian, latrias, using the same word, distinguishing between the timi kind of proskuenesis and the latria kind of proskuenesis. So if I were to make a graph to kind of help clarify this, you have the word proskuenesis, which could mean different things depending on the context. It can be a kind of greeting or honoring or welcoming, whatever. If it's directed towards God, then it's classified as the kind of proskuenesis latrias, okay? And you have examples of this in John 4:20, Hebrews 1:6. But if the proskuenesis is directed towards a person, and it's not a person who the subject considers a deity or a god, it's just a person who they consider worthy or honorable, then that's the timitiki kind of proskuenesis, the veneration of honor. And you can see this in Genesis 33:3, Matthew 8:2, Matthew 18:26, lots of examples of this in the Bible. So just get this concept down, because that's the goalpost, linguistically speaking. What the way the Bible is using this is it's using the word proskuenesis, throwing it around all over the place, assuming that you can tell the difference between the kind that's honorable and the kind that's worshipful. This distinction, the reason why they chose the word latrias, is based on a unique feature of the Greek language. And this is going to be really important later, especially when we're talking about Latin translators trying to make sense of this. The word latrias in Greek is from the Greek word latria, which denotes a kind of divine service due only to God alone. So it literally means service, but it's specifically service to a deity. So it's a kind of like worshipful or liturgical or slavery to a god. Okay, that's sort of the meaning of the word latria. The biblical there's a biblical basis for applying latria only to God, and it's in Matthew 4:10. It's also in Luke 4:8. And it's in the words of Christ himself. He says, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you latrevsis," latria, or serve. Okay, so he uses the word only there. Him only shall you latrevsis. Okay, incredibly, and this is incredible, and you kind of take a moment to soak this in, because this is a cool point. Both the New Testament and the Septuagint, which is in Greek, are completely consistent with this terminology. At no point in either the New Testament or the Septuagint is latria ever used towards a creature in a non-idolatrous way. If there is service being used towards a person, it uses a different Greek word called doulia, which also means service. Okay, so Greek has this innate feature of being able to distinguish two kinds of service: the kind of service to a god, latria, and service to a creature in a non-worshipful way, doulia. And this is unique to the Greek language. So, and I really want to point out that in the Septuagint, they were aware of this, and they were translating the Bible, and they would distinguish between, okay, am I going to use doulia in this context, or am I going to use latria in this context? And they chose depending on the context. So this distinction goes back to the translators of the Septuagint. That's in the 3rd century BC. So the distinction between, the doulia to God and the doulia to creatures and the latria to God is a distinction that goes back all the way to the 3rd century BC. Okay, the Hebrew word behind both of these is the same Hebrew word, so it required the Septuagint translators to make this distinction. So you can see this if you look at the Hebrew text. I'm comparing Deuteronomy 6:13 with Genesis 29:18. They both use the word serve. So Deuteronomy 6:13 says, "You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him." Genesis 29:18 says, "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." So this is Jacob serving Laban to take Rachel as his wife. And the word serve is used in both of these cases. And the Hebrew word avad is used in both cases, right? So you shall fear the Lord your God and avad him, okay? And Genesis 29 says the same word, "I will avad you 7 years for Rachel." So there's no distinction in Hebrew, in the original Hebrew of these passages. However, if you look at the Septuagint in these passages, in Deuteronomy 16:13, it uses the word latrevsis for Deuteronomy 6:13, and it uses the word doulevso for the Genesis 29 passage. So it distinguishes two different Greek words for the same Hebrew word, right? Distinguish. So you can see this with your own eyes. Just look at this on the screen and appreciate it. That right before your eyes, you're seeing the same word in Hebrew is being distinguished in a 3rd century BC translation into Greek. So it's not something that theologians made up later, like, oh, we're going to make up veneration versus worship. It's not an invention of later theologians. It's based on a principle going way back to pre-Christian times, pre-Christian Judaism. The word timitiki, right, from timitiki proskuenesis, the veneration of honor, is based on the Greek word timi, which means honor. It just simply means honor. And of course, very easy to demonstrate, this is also based on the Bible. And the Bible has many instructions to give honor, or timi, to people. The Bible tells to give honor to fellow Christians, to parents, spouses, leaders, and all people to whom honor is due. We have in Romans, "Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love in honor." Same word, timi. "Render therefore all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, honor to whom honor is due, timin to whom timin is due. Let the elders who rule be counted worthy of double honor." The word timi is being used. "Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving timi to the wife." So the Bible is very, very clear that giving honor is a part of Christian life to whoever honor is due. And doesn't it make sense that saints would also receive honor as heroes of the faith? In fact, that's exactly what the Bible teaches. It teaches that honor awaits the saints of God. So this is in Romans chapter 2. God will render each one according to his deeds, eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, the word timi is used, and immortality. And to those people, God will give glory, honor, timi, and peace. So giving honor to saints is God's idea. It's his plan, it's his idea, and it's in perfect accordance with the Christian life according to the scriptures. So that's where they're getting this word. This distinction, latrias proskuenesis versus timitiki proskuenesis. So they're saying, well, proskuenesis can go either way. We're going to make it latrias proskuenesis, which narrows it down specifically to God. And then timitiki proskuenesis, which opens it up as honor. It can be honor to a spouse, to a leader, to a saint, whatever. So the biblical commands to offer timi to honorable people and latria to God only come from the Bible. Sometimes proskuenesis is to God, as in Deuteronomy 26:10, and other times it's to honorable people, and you see that in Genesis 42:6. Therefore, it follows, logically, proskuenesis to God is expressing latria. That's latrias proskuenesis, exactly the same words in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Proskuenesis to honorable people expressing timi, that's timitiki proskuenesis. Again, the exact same words right out of the Bible. So the goalposts of the discussing worship versus veneration, it's in Greek, the exact same words being used in the New Testament And they're backed by the Old Testament, of course. And you can see the part one of this video series if you want to go to more about the Hebrew behind proskuenesis. So as the Bible demonstrates, the linguistic distinction follows a distinction of faith and intention of the one doing proskuenesis. So you have the same word in Greek or Hebrew, shakah, it means the exact same thing. And depending on the faith and intention, by context, you can tell if it's a timi or if it's a latria kind of proskuenesis or shakah. And the Seventh Ecumenical Council is just taking these words. Well, we know latria is to God alone. We know timi is to honorable people. We're just going to use those words to distinguish these things that we're seeing in the Bible. So the Greek fathers were not using new words. They weren't using new doctrines. They were using biblical words to highlight biblical observations. So the Septuagint, the New Testament, the Greek fathers, the Seventh Ecumenical Council were all consistent in using one language to talk about these things. So let's talk about Latin, okay? I love Latin, but Latin is where things start to go a little bit crazy, okay? Because Greek was the preferred language of the apostles, as we know, they wrote the New Testament in Greek, and they spoke Greek, they had liturgies in Greek. Latin-speaking Christians in the early church were left to speak about faith in their own words, using local translations of scriptures. So they received the scriptures in Greek, they heard prayers in Greek, they did services in Greek. Over time, they started to use more Latin, which was their own native language that they speak at home. But they didn't have scriptures in Latin. They didn't have the prayers in Latin. So they were making local translations. If you know the story of the Vulgate, you're already familiar with this story. For 4 centuries, Latin-speaking Christians were kind of left on their own to rely on local translations. And standardization finally came with the publication of the Latin Vulgate. So St. Jerome, per the Vulgate, translated proskuenesis, or shakah in Hebrew, consistently as the Latin word adoro or adoratio, even in most places where proskuenesis or shakah is not directed towards God. This was very interesting. Because St. Jerome himself didn't seem to like to use the word adoro for a creature. He liked to use that word for God. But he was following the Hebrew, which has no problem giving shakah towards creatures. So you have this, the Vulgate, which is following the Hebrew and the Greek, consistently translating shakah as adoro, even though St. Jerome was looking for a kind of linguistic distinction. He wanted adoro to be towards God. So like the words proskuenesis and shakah, adoro in the 4th century didn't strictly mean worship to a divine being, but also could be directed towards creatures in certain contexts. So one example from Exodus 18:7 from the Vulgate, Moses sui adoravit et osculatus est eum. Okay, adored and kissed Jethro. So the word adored and kissed Jethro. Obviously, he's not worshiping Jethro. He's giving a kind of veneration or honor or whatever you want to call it. Did obeisance, bowed. But the word there is adoro. So where Greek relied on its latria versus doulia distinction to specify latrias proskuenesis, which is worship to God alone, Latin has no way to make this distinction. Now, this is really important. Remember that latria and doulia, those 2 words, that's unique to Greek. Latin does not have the same distinction in its word for service. In Latin, both doulia, service, and latria, divine service, are one word, servio or servio, which means service. So English can distinguish between 2 kinds of proskuenesis using worship and veneration. And Greek can distinguish between 2 kinds of service using doulia and latria, but Latin can linguistically distinguish between neither. And it had to borrow from Greek to make the distinction, okay? So if you were to literally translate latrias proskuenesis into Latin, it would be something like adoratio serviti, which could also mean doulias proskuenesis, so that which has no exclusiveness to God. So if you translate latrias proskuenesis, which in Greek is very obviously towards God alone, it completely loses its exclusiveness in Latin. So it's a totally useless phrase. So St. Augustine writes the following, pointing out this problem. He says, "For this is the worship which is due to the divinity, or to speak more accurately, to the deity, and to express this worship in a single word, as there does not occur to me any Latin term sufficiently exact, I shall avail myself, whenever necessary, of a Greek word. Latria, whenever it occurs in Scripture, is rendered by the word service. But that service which is due to men, and in reference to which the apostle writes that servants must be subject to their own masters, is usually designated by another word in Greek, that's doulia, whereas the service which is paid to God alone by worship is always or almost always called latria in the usage of those who wrote from the divine oracles." So this is St. Augustine pointing out this problem is I don't have any Latin word to make this distinguished worship to God alone, so I'm just going to borrow from Greek and use the word latria whenever I feel like I need it. And he's making this reference to this distinction in Greek. So Latin has this deficiency compared to the Greek. And you can see it with your own eyes. We have, again, Deuteronomy 6:13 and Genesis 29:18. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him. In Latin, Dominum Deum tuum timebis et ipsi servies. Okay. The Greek word here is latreusis. In Genesis 29:18, I will serve you 7 years. Okay. Serviam. Same exact Latin base word, serve. But in Greek, of course, it's doulia, doulevso. So you have this problem in Latin, which ends up being a challenge. Now, this part's really important in the story because there is a development here, and it's very confusing when you start comparing the Vulgate to the early church fathers to Thomas Aquinas and whatever. Something doesn't fit, but there's sort of a cultural development that happens linguistically surrounding worship. So despite the Vulgate translating Proskuenesis as adoro, even in places where it doesn't mean worship, Western Christians developed a sense that adoro is appropriate only to God. So the Vulgate uses adoro all over the place between creatures. But despite that, there's developed this sense in the West that adoro or adoration is only to God. And I think this is natural, right? Because they believe in one God. They want to worship one God. They want a word to describe that worship to one God. So they just naturally were inclined and gravitated towards using the word adoro for God. And if we're being honest, they probably didn't have the skills to read the Bible throughout many of these we're talking 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, right? I don't know how high the literacy rate was in the West, but they probably didn't have the Old Testament to sort of check that. And they were just living out their experience as Christians. We worship only one God, and we don't worship anyone else. And they use the word adoro to describe their worship to God. So this developed a really strong sense. This developed as a very strong sense in the West. So on one hand, the West valued a literal translation of the Bible into Latin. So it was following that Greek, that Hebrew. Every time it said shaka, it was saying adoro in Latin. But on the other hand, they liked having one word for worship towards God. So St. Jerome himself, who translated the Vulgate, and this is where it gets confusing, but these are his own words. He says, "We, it is true, refuse to worship or adore," that's adoramus, "I say not the relics of the martyrs, but even the sun and moon, the angels and archangels, the cherubim and seraphim, and every name that is named, not only in this world, but also that which is to come. For we may not serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. We honor the relics of the martyrs, that we may adore him whose martyrs they are." So he wants to say that we honor the relics and the saints, but we adore God, even though this distinction between honor and adore isn't even coming from the Bible that he translated. So there's this linguistic dissonance in the Latin language, because you have to make a decision to follow the Greek literally, slavishly, or try to, make it up, and then it won't fit with the Greek. So this is a struggle that was inherent between the two languages. So strong was the sentiment um, that is adoro to God alone, that some Western Christians rejected the Seventh Ecumenical Council because when it was first translated, it used the word adoro for venerate. So whoever translated the Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council used the word adoro in Latin for venerate, for proskuenesis. They followed proskuenesis, adoro every time. And the Latin Christians read that and they said, oh my gosh, adore means worship. You're worshiping icons, you're worshiping saints, you're worshiping relics. And it was a scandal because the West had developed a strong sense that adoration is to God alone. But the translators were just following the language of the Vulgate, right? They're just following following the Greek. So Henry R. Percival, he writes, but unfortunately, as I have said, we have neither in Hebrew, Latin, nor English any word with this, that's latrias, restricted meaning. And therefore, when it became necessary to translate the Greek Acts and the decree of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, great difficulty was experienced, and by the use of adoro as the equivalent to proskuneo, many were scandalized, thinking that it was divine adoration which they were to give to sacred images, which they knew would be idolatry. So there was this big scandal in the West when they saw the word adoro being used towards icons and towards saints. Because they wanted this word to be to God alone. That's what developed in their religious life. But the Vulgate was just slavishly following the Greek, and then the translator of the Seventh Ecumenical Council was slavishly following what the Vulgate had laid down. So it was a real problem. So in response to this lack of clarity and the scandal, the terminology surrounding veneration and worship in Latin was developed by Latin theologians. And you find ultimately the West settling with the formula of Thomas Aquinas, found in his Summa Theologica, in his question 25. He provides the following distinctions. God alone receives adoratio latriae. So he takes this word latria from Greek and literally transliterates it into Latin. Whereas saints receive veneratio duliae. Okay, taking that word dulia from Greek. So Thomas Aquinas doesn't use the word adoro for saints. He uses the word veneratio, which is where we get the word veneration. So he's trying to use different words slightly. Some he's taking directly from Greek to communicate this principle. So latria and dulia were translated from Greek because their distinction doesn't exist in Latin. Notably, adoro is assigned to God alone and distinguished from veneration, which has now been assigned to saints. This linguistic distinction would go on to be adopted in the Catholic Church as the distinction between adoration and veneration, which is what you hear from Catholics today if you ask them. So the shift to using veneration or veneratio for saints is a development from the language of earlier fathers. It's a development of the language from the earlier fathers, but it was a necessary one because adoro was not comfortable being assigned to saints. So yeah, maybe the early fathers didn't use the word veneratio for saints, but the Bible uses proskuenesis to people, and it didn't translate over well to Latin, so they had to find some other word to accommodate that dulia kind of veneration. So this formula came up. I don't know if it started with Thomas Aquinas or if he was the one who popularized it, but definitely it was a distinction that he was making and became the standard distinction for the Latin-speaking Western Christians of the Catholic Church. So the Vulgate only uses the word veneratio 3 times, none of which is towards people. So you can see this development in real time if you compare the language of the Vulgate to the language of Thomas Aquinas. Early Christian writings in Latin, such as that from St. Jerome, seem to associate veneratio with the pagan worship of deities, which was kind of its older, ancient association. Do we, every time that we enter the basilicas of apostles and prophets and martyrs, pay homage to the shrines of idols? The word pay homage there being veneramur, venerate. So is Thomas Aquinas saying that we, worship idols? No, he's not saying anything about worshiping saints or worshiping idols. He's looking for linguistic tools to communicate that Greek sense of the word because Latin is unable to do it out of the box. So it's going to take some, fandangling to get the Latin to really communicate that principle. So this development works really well within Latin. It effectively communicates the principle of worship versus veneration, which exists in Greek, in the language, and in the scriptures. But if you try to connect that back to the Greek, it becomes really messy really fast. And this disconnect between the Greek and the Latin, this is really, I think it's a huge factor in why veneration versus worship is rejected by Protestants, because they're looking at the veneration versus adoration distinction. They're comparing it to the Greek scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures, and they're seeing this messy disconnect. And so they're going to reject it as non-biblical. But we need to really keep this history in mind, that the truth is this: the theologians did not invent a new doctrine, but rather developed a linguistic framework to accommodate the biblical doctrine in their own language. So they were trying to find a way in Latin to communicate what they were seeing in the original languages, albeit imperfectly. So if you try to connect these words, it ends up being a big mess. You have dulia, latria, which both mean serve, which latria can be adoration, adoratio, which could be adoration, but adoratio can be worship, which is also proskuenesis, which is also venerate, but venerate is veneratio. Then you have worship, which is proskuenesis, but that's also latria, which is, then you have cultus. Anyways, it ends up being a big, big nightmare. And this is why I say within Latin itself, in its own little Latin world, it works good. Greek within its own little Greek world works good. The principles exist in both, reflecting the biblical principle, but linguistically there's a disconnect between the words because Latin is trying to communicate that Greek principle. So veneration versus worship in Latin conclusion. Later Latin theologians did their best to communicate the principle of the biblical Greek despite the deficiencies in the Latin language. Regardless of how confusing or superficial the distinction in Latin between adoration and veneration seems, there is nothing superficial in the Greek upon which it's based, that latria versus dulia distinction. The problems are not the fault of Latin theologians, but the lack of clarity in certain Greek and Latin terms. So we're talking about Latin because Latin is going to influence English, which is going to influence English translations. And it's really important to find out where did it split? Where did it go from being biblical Greek to being this developed Latin language? And that's going to ultimately affect the Catholic distinctions in English. So in Catholic English, I call it Catholic English because Catholics have their own vocabulary about these things, which really come from the Latin. The adoration versus venerate distinction was provided to Catholics by their theologians in synodal statements, making it a quintessential Catholic doctrine. So they have Thomas Aquinas, the Council of Trent, and so on, who use the adoration versus veneration distinction following the developed Latin framework. Again, not principally or not essentially developed by theologians, but linguistically developed by theologians. They say we adore Christ and we venerate the saints. This is from the Council of Trent. So let's compare this with Protestant English. And I say Catholic English, Protestant English, because they're pulling their terms from different sources. The Catholics are pulling it from their Latin theologians. The Protestants are going to pull it from their English translation of the Bible. So Protestant Bibles did not contain the distinction between worship and veneration, or adoration and veneration. And in the case of the King James Version, there are no instances of either the word adore or venerate in its text. Isn't that crazy? Not one time does the King James use the word adore or venerate. So how are you going to tell me that speaking as, from a Protestant perspective, how are you going to tell me that the Bible teaches adoration versus veneration if the words aren't in the Bible one time? The King James Version was extremely influential in Protestantism for centuries and established the religious language for Protestants. So they love to use words from the King James Bible because that's, to them, that's the Bible. And if you start using words outside the Bible, they're less likely to be receptive of it. So, and this is going to be amplified. This rejection of adoration versus veneration is going to be amplified because they rejected the practice altogether. They have the principle of glory to God alone, which was essentially directed towards the Catholic practice of veneration to saints. So there is some historical doctrinal biases, I would say, that are coming in with Protestantism against this distinction between veneration and adoration. And to be fair, there were legitimate abuses of saint veneration that were, could be absolutely described as idolatrous in the West leading up to the Protestant Reformation. So there is some historical, how do I say it, just baggage that the Protestants are dealing with on the issue of veneration going too far. So they don't like this distinction. They don't see the words in the Bible. They have nothing to do with it, okay? But this is really important to keep in mind when you're looking at modern translations, because the majority of English translations are going to be from Protestant translators. And this principle of soli Deo Gloria, this glory to God alone, drives Protestant translators to be inclined to incline their translations against this doctrine of adoration versus veneration. So, for example, if they see, in the Greek it says something like he venerated him, or they see in Greek a sentence that could be translated as he venerated him or he did obeisance to him, the Protestant will always go with did obeisance to him because that's going to align more with their value that you don't give divine worship to a person. So just keep in mind when you're dealing with modern translations, the majority are Protestant. There is a linguistic heritage coming from the King James Version. There is a historical inclinations that's coming with them. So another reason why you don't see, I actually want to talk about why the King James translators didn't use the word adore in their translation, because I think that this is right. This is part of the Catholic formula is we adore Christ, we venerate the saints. Okay, but why didn't the King James translators even use the word adore? It's important to keep in mind that they were translating from Hebrew and Greek. They weren't translating from Latin. So they weren't inclined towards Latin-based words. So if you're looking in a Latin text and you see the word adoro, you're going to want to translate that as adore because adore comes from the Latin word adoro. So adoration is the obvious translation of adoratio. But proskuenesis, which is the Greek word with the same meaning, can be adoration or worship, which are synonymous. And the King James translators simply wanted to go with the more English word worship. Okay, so just keep this stuff in mind, because when you're looking at the Bible in English, why aren't they using the word adoration? There's all these little things that are coming together that are making this Bible step by step inclined against this doctrine. But they're not really, saying polar opposite things. It's just how it's worded, word choices, little biases, little, I don't know, which are using the English word or the Latin-based word. So I want to talk about venerate in the Bible, because this is a really good question, I think. If the Bible talks so much about venerating saints, why doesn't it use the word venerate in the Bible? And I provide 4 reasons why I think the Bible doesn't use the word venerate. The first reason is it is, kind of, and I'm talking specifically about the King James Version. In early modern English, worship seemed to have a wider range of meaning, which could include veneration and isn't restricted to a divine being like modern English. So, Dictionarium Britannicum from 1730 by Nathan Bailey, and this is over 100 years after King James, but even still, by that time, it had this meaning. It's a dictionary, and it has the definition of worship as to adore, to reverence, to pay obeisance or submission to. So it's not just worshiping a divine being like it is in modern English, but at that time it had a little wider meaning of reverencing, doing obeisance, submitting to. So in certain places where the word worship is used in the King James Version, the word venerate could be substituted. And I think a good example of this is in Matthew 2 with the 3 wise men. I don't actually think they're going to Jesus to give him worship as a god, as a divine person, but using their own words, they're going there to pay homage to him as a king. And in this sense, you you can use the word venerate. So where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. I think what they intended to say was they were coming to pay homage to the King of the Jews. Okay, so venerate this King of the Jews. The second reason I give why the word venerate isn't used in the King James Version, which ended up setting the heritage, the linguistic heritage for all modern English translations, is it does use the word veneration, but it uses the synonym for veneration, reverence. Okay, so we have another dictionary from 1708 that makes reverence a synonym of venerate. It says that to venerate means to reverence or to respect or to honor. So if we let reverence substitute for its synonym venerate, then it occurs actually many times in the Bible. We have Leviticus 19:30. Ye shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. You could say that God is saying here to venerate the sanctuary of his temple. It means the exact same thing. 2 Samuel 9:6. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. So he comes to David the king and he falls on his face and does veneration. Means the same thing. Okay, again, 1 Kings 1:31, Esther 3:2, Matthew 21:37. The third reason that I want to give is the word venerate just simply isn't popular in English. Okay, and so I have an Ingram's graph provided by Google showing the occurrence of the words worship, honor, reverence, and venerate from the year 1500 to the present. And this yellow line is worship, and the blue line is venerate. And you can barely even see the blue line because it's almost completely at zero the whole time. And you can see how popular the word worship is, honor and reverence are compared to venerate. It's just not a word that people are using very much throughout the history of the English language. So I think when modern Bible translators are translating the Bible, they're trying to use language that's contemporary, language that's normal. They're not going to use, fringe theological terms in a contemporary English translation. They're just not going to do it. So I think that's another reason why you don't see the word venerate in the Bible. And then the last reason I'll give is the King James translators often translated the literal action of doing proskuenesis or doing shakah, which is a kind of obeisance or bowing, rather than using the word venerate, which is a little more theological, a little more based on the intention of the person than the actual act itself. So if a person falls down and does obeisance in veneration of another person, the King James Version translates did obeisance. Okay, so even though the act is an act of veneration, they won't use the word veneration, they'll just say did obeisance. So this is all over the place. Genesis 37:7. It's in Exodus 18:7, 2 Samuel 1:2. Okay, you can read these for yourself if you're interested. All of these passages use the Hebrew word shakah, which in the Septuagint is proskuenesis. It's the word for venerate in Hebrew and Greek. So you can easily substitute this did obeisance as venerate in these cases, but they're describing more the literal act itself than the intention. And here's one example from Chronicle, I guess it's First or Second Chronicles 24:17. Now after the death of Jehoiada came the princes of Judah and made obeisance to the king. Okay, so obviously this isn't worshiping the king. It's an example of giving veneration to the king. So why don't we see venerate in modern Bibles? Well, of course, the majority of Bibles in English are from Protestant translators. So they take with it the whole Protestant heritage with it. And with the Protestant heritage comes the King James Version. That's the main Protestant Bible for centuries in the history of Protestantism. So if the King James Version is not using the word venerate, it's not going to be inherited by the Protestants. By the way, you can use reverence as a substitute when talking, to Protestants. I think they'd be much more comfortable if you told them we worship God and we reverence the saints, because the word reverence is used in the King James Bible, right? But if the word venerate was used, they'd be comfortable with that. So there's a linguistic heritage that they're receiving and using. If the Greek says Jacob worshipped on the top of his staff, they will add leaning to make it not about the venerating of the staff. So this is just an example I'm trying to give of the principles, the sort of inclinations of Protestants to interpret the text in ways where it aligns with their values and their principles. Okay. Venerate is still unpopular. People just don't use it. And regarding Catholic Bibles, many of them today are just um, revisions of Protestant Bibles, so they're barely changed. And some of the interpretations in these Catholic Bibles just follow the interpretations of Protestants. So don't think that you're going to go to Catholic Bibles and find anything too different. So just to give a conclusion on this, why don't we see adoration versus veneration in the Bible? The adoration versus veneration distinction is a linguistic framework developed by Latin theologians, so you're not going to see it in the Bible if it took time to develop it. However, despite being developed, it is based on a biblical principle, which was defined originally by the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which was taking the words directly out of the Bible in its original languages. And again, this development in Latin being based on a Latin deficiency, not a malicious desire by theologians. And modern Bibles continue in their Protestant traditions, which is the heritage of the King James Version. The King James Version just didn't pull from Latin like the Catholics did and didn't inherit that Latin tradition, and really set the linguistic framework for Protestants and who also follow their Protestant principles. So all of these things considered, it makes total sense when on one hand you have worship versus veneration being absolutely biblical, and then yet the Bible not saying it. Okay, so you end up in this weird situation, but there is a reason for it. And if you take it and you lay everything out and you analyze it, you do begin to understand why that is the case. So thank you for watching. I hope that you learned something. Hope you enjoyed this. If you have any comments or questions, please leave a comment, like the video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the third part where I talk about passages in the Bible that Protestants will use against the veneration of saints, and I'll be talking about why they actually don't. So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching. See you next time.